Hello, everyone. We're here this afternoon, this evening, to talk about culture and what we can do to bring culture back to the forefront. Before I introduce our different speakers, I invite you all, for health reasons, to put your masks on, please. I have the pleasure of moderating this session with Françoise Benamou, who's a specialist in the economy of culture and a professor at the University of Sorbonne Paris Nord and Sciences Po. And Laurent Bell, who's the director of the Cité de la Musique Philharmonique in Paris, Jean-François Chounier, who's the president of the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilizations, the MUSEM, as well as Jean-Jacques Guillonnier, who's the financial director and CEO of the LVMH Group, Mrs. Laurent Descartes, who's the president of the Musée d'Orsay and the Musée de l'Orangerie, and beside me, Masha Markeyev, who's the head of La Criée Theatre, the National Theatre in Marseille. So let's begin with Françoise, who's going to explain what's been going on in the last 18 months. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just a few words to introduce today's debate. It's clear that culture paid a heavy price to the crisis. There were many difficulties encountered by artists to begin with, the theater companies, different establishments, and cultural commerce. Plays were not put on, books were not published, foreign artists were not able to come to our country. There was a lot of misunderstanding, and I think of this debate about what is essential, what makes sense, and the loss of meaning that when we shift aside culture to when we close the sites that are able to open, the cultural world felt misunderstood and not taken into account. Things have gotten better. The theaters and the museums are open. A lot of festivals are being organized. But we're not coming out without wounds from this crisis. There have been too many events, and there's the possibility of creating more than we can disseminate. The cultural economy has built its economic models on the series of events with an inflationist trend and competition that has derived from that. We've gone from 1 to 2 literary seasons, a multitude of festivals, each city wanting to organize their own festival. Museums have entered the race. Works of art have just found the time to exist before we have to move on to the next one. And the crisis has shown that the integration into globalization could carry the best and the worst. Cultural globalization does not necessarily mean uniformization. It can represent opening, exchange, a dialogue between cultures. But with the crisis, artists and works of art were not able to travel. And we had to completely review schedules. More modestly, more locally, more green. This is what we're hearing today. This could be a horizon, a reasonable horizon for projects that are more in sync with the world of tomorrow. But we have to bear in mind what this implies. France has always been a land of opportunity for artists, and quality is often costly, and we should not forget that. Let's not go back to what we called the Baumol law, with the name of this American economist who said that if you can't count on productivity, living spectacle and shows would end up with poor quality or highly dependent on public financing and private donators. We've also had to deal with the arrival of digital. We see movie theaters compare in competition with Amazon Prime and Netflix, Disney, with a double dimension, the distribution of works of art that have been captured on these platforms, and also an evolution in content with the rise of series and the audience that it captures, and this with the based on the dictate of algorithms that understand our taste in order to work on them. Museums, after this period of defiance, started to digitalize their collections and make them available in digital format, offering virtual visits of the museum. The economic model still needs to be found, but this could push the walls of the theaters and museums back, bring in a greater number of people into the real area, and shift the cursor of the public sociology. We've also seen a multiplication of a private offer that's been deployed in many parts of our territory, and that don't simply come from the co-financing with the public financing. We've seen a lot of foundations, and they work in a complementary way to public funds. Let's not be too innocent, and all of this leads us to question French contemporary world and opens it up to competition. It also improves and increases creativity, opens the game of creativity and the dissemination of art. So from a crisis, we see the good and the bad. We can think of Aesop with both the poison and the remedy. The crisis leads us to think of the world of the future, which is no longer the same and not completely different. And as my colleague Robert Boyer, the economist, said, from the past, we will not wipe out completely, but we can imagine what we can try to do together for tomorrow, a capitalism that gives room to art and to artists. Thank you.
Merci, Françoise.
So, Françoise, before we start talking about the future and what culture should be in the future and how it should evolve, I would like to come back for a moment to the impact that this crisis had on the sector, the economic impact. Today, the cultural sector represents 97 billion euros. This represents roughly 2% of our GDP, and it employs almost 630,000 people as in their main jobs, 80,000 companies. That's a significant number. And if we look at a more wider level and we take into account culture and its effect on tourism, we can double that and bring up to 5% of GDP. What have we seen in the last 18 months? Clearly, not everyone was impacted in the same way by this crisis, by the closing of our theaters, of museums, of elements of our cultural heritage. We know it's living spectacle, living art that paid the highest tribute, visual arts, our heritage, and architecture. On the other hand, this crisis was a boon for books. We saw that there was a real increase of 20% in the purchase of books. This was also good for comic strips, video, and digital platforms, as you said earlier, Françoise. I'd like to ask you all the following question. How, as heads and managers of institutes, how did you live through this period? And let's start with Masha. Well, this period was a very unusual period for us. The lights were off. There was violent histories that were often associated with these types of periods when art was shut down. But this wasn't the case here. We were sheltered. We were sheltered from the vision of others, which in a certain way canceled us out. So it was an experience that's never existed in previous centuries, that theaters be closed for such a long period of time. Canceling a show is creating a black hole, and it's a gap that we can still feel organically. And that's why I'm uncomfortable to try to draw conclusions from this. It's still it's an extension of everything that did not occur, and this loss is something that we haven't finished measuring. And yet at the same time, of course, there's a deep worry due to uncertainty. But when there's uncertainty, there's also a feeling of excitement. How will we be able to renew desire, the public's desire, the artist's desire, the desire to create with what we've just experienced, what we've lived through? The works of art the plays that we present this season are prophetic, and they already contain what we've been through, an interrogation about human mystery, questions about realism and real histories. Artists were a step ahead of us, and I believe in this economy of what is destined to exist, and we must create this economy, and we have to fight against people cowering into their corners. We need movement, we need flow, we need exchange. We need the other. Exchange is the other. We need to bring down all of our concerns that are organically within us. The theater is the complete opposite, sitting side by side with people you don't know, facing artists. It's magnificent human geography that we need to bring back as quickly as we can. Jean-Jacques Guiony. I'm going to bring us back to earth after this very relevant analysis. I'm not in charge of a cultural institution, even if the Louis Vuitton Foundation is an important player in the arts. I realized during this period that there were some parallels between the luxury industry that I'm in charge of and cultural institutions very quickly, and to encourage a discussion and to delve into these points. The first parallel that I would draw is in the presence of international customers or audience. An institution like the Louvre, 75% of the customer base is international. This is the same for luxury boutiques in Paris. And when these international clients and visitors are no longer here, that's the first problem that comes up. Is there's a massive hole in footfall, and the result is a real problem, a real topic. I think that some cultural institutions and the luxury goods industry in Europe are sharing some shortfalls in this, and we didn't focus enough on our local customers and local public. And that was a mistake, because they can compensate for the disappearance of international visitors. It's also a question of credibility. Why would visitors come to see institutions and shops that our national residents are ignoring? The second point concerns the digital, and we saw in the luxury goods industry and the cultural industry the same thing. Can a digital experience replace a physical experience? And the answer is clearly no. When there's no physical experience at all, the theaters are closed, the museums are closed, the shops are closed. It's better than nothing, but the substitution is incomplete, because in both cases there is a transmission of emotion, and that emotion isn't passed through a screen. So at best, it's just a poor substitute, and we need to look at the role of digital technologies. Is it just to accompany it, culture, or is it a substitution? Thirdly, the brand. The brand is a capital that, from the outset, we can trust, and that the user can understand and trust before you push the door of the theater, the museum, or the shop. So it's important capital, particularly in difficult moments. And very honestly, it's easier to maintain in the luxury goods industry than it is in culture. But I believe that it's one of the elements, one of the fundamental elements of the cultural proposition to develop brands, not in a commercial sense, but in terms of brand awareness, which means that visitors, customers can identify with it. Let me give you the example of the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim is a series of museums whose brand awareness goes well beyond the cultural proposition that is theirs. They've worked on architectural projects through history. They've been able to develop a presence, a brand that goes well beyond what they are, and that's a real asset for them. Thank you. Laurence Descartes. For the museums, the admiral ships of our national museums, it's been very difficult this period of crisis. It's not been it's been a time where we've had to challenge the way that we operate. It's been an accelerator of trends. You talked about the digital aspects. I'm a little bit more critical of digital than you are. And maybe more profoundly, it's a political question for these big artistic vessels that are supported by the state that will continue to get the support this year that we definitely needed. I'm at the head of a museum that's suffering terribly from the drop in international tourist footfall. And I'm taking over the Louvre Museum in September, and this museum was hard hit by the crisis. So there's some real profound questions on the model, what we want to do collectively in these spaces. What do they say to us today and tomorrow? Those are urgent questions for the people who are responsible for these sites, these venues, because before they are economic questions, they're questions of values, of missions, of meaning. Culture is meaning before it's anything else. And this obliges us to come back to the basics, not just in our vision of local. I'm quite reserved about that question because that comes back to folding in upon ourselves and finding this easy level of comfort. I believe that we need to be culturally ambitious. I believe in risk-taking. I believe in international cooperation. I believe in opening. And I think that these places like the Louvre, Orsay, La Comédie Française, l'Opéra de Paris are venues that really carry the brand of France's cultural ambition. So what's going to happen in the coming years? Will we come back to a self-financing capacity or not? Must the state continue to help us for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? Who knows? So these are the big questions that we're already facing. Jean-François Chounier. The situations are quite diverse in terms of cultural institutions and venues. In Marseille, we weren't subject to the same loss of revenue from international tourism. International tourism in MUSEM only represents 15% of the total tourism in our museum. So it's a much lower rate for us. And Marseille was very fashionable last summer, and I think it will be again this summer. So we've been able to offset those elements. We've seen from Marseille what suffered the most, in my opinion, without being pretentious enough to think I can cover this entirely, but the cultural institutions, thanks to all levels of state aid, have been able to economically survive. Even though we have a lot of difficulties, projects were canceled, there was suffering in the workplace, things that we cannot forget. But what's really striking in our region is the difficulty of access for young professionals. I mean that in the widest sense of the term. Actors, technicians, mediators, young curators who were not physically able to begin their projects. It's very difficult today to draw conclusions because it's going to have incalculable consequences in the coming years. We started by closing 2 months, then 203 days. I know these numbers by heart. It's more impressive when you talk in days than months. And throughout this period, and this is true for all cultural venues, that there were no young artists who were allowed to begin their careers. There were no new shows that were put on. So this natural regenerescence that's so vital did not occur. And I'm not capable today to say what economic and cultural consequences this will give rise to. As Masha said, It's something that's never happened before. Seeing theaters closed for a year, that never happened, even during the wars in France. We don't know what the long-term consequences will be from this situation. Laurent Bell. As Françoise said, it took a bit of time, but let's recognize, and I'm talking about the short-term situation, let's recognize that culture received a lot of support, helpful support from the state. That's clear. Perhaps that doesn't give us a vision for the future, but in the short term, we have to be happy. 11 billion euros. The state indicates that the level of aid was at this level. People are putting forward this 11 billion euro amount, but I don't have no details. But to take a shortcut, it's better to be a musician in a French permanent orchestra than in one in London, where you could already be a taxi driver, which has happened to a lot of musicians in the London National Orchestra. So these measures always leave some people by the wayside. There are some gaps, and I can mention three that should cause the cultural sector to do some self-examination. The private sector in living spectacle was stopped. That says something, because we like or we don't like the private sector, but there's popular culture, and we tend to oppose this to what we call legitimate culture, which was able to continue its activity thanks to state support. And the private theaters went under, and I think that we need to say that the culture, this question should not only apply to public venues, but should have looked at private venues also. We can sometimes talk about temporary situations. The permanent venues were supported. People who were not necessarily solo artists, solo musicians, or composers, etc. There was real damage for these people. Real harm was done. And I would also like to say that there's a cultural institute, a theater, an opera. It can't only be a place that presents shows. We have to find balance and bring into relationship creation, production, and transmission. And transmission is a disaster. All of the work that was done by theaters and opera houses and orchestras, ourselves, for the young people, for the young people's orchestras, setting up participatory operas, all that was just shut down. And I would tend to say that that work is often focused on what we call less favored neighborhoods, where it's proven that they have suffered more than the others in this 18-month period. And again, culture is the reflection of society. And this is where we've had the hardest time staying in contact despite all of the efforts that were undertaken. And here, digital was a real not really appreciated. I felt that there was the start of a debate between Laurence Descartes and Jacques Guyanny on the role of digital. Is digital a way of surviving economically, or was it used that way during this period? Or do you think that the digital technologies will be a way of creating new worlds of imagination and to extend a hand to populations that are quite distant from culture? I'm speaking for the museums, which is the field that I know the best. It's something that is new, and we need to understand how it works. And museums have had a classic institutional vision of this. What the crisis taught us is that we can create new formats, new way of talking about our collections, our activities, cultural programming in the widest sense of the term. And clearly, we reached a population that we were not reaching previously. That's obvious, and we see that in visitors these days in the Orsay Museum. So I think that there's a nuance. It's not, it wasn't just a one-time solution, and it doesn't replace our original works of art. And it shouldn't replace the desire to experience it in real life. But it did, the crisis did allow us to take a conceptual step forward. I see this with the Orsay teams. It's not, we no longer just have a digital department. Digital's everywhere. They're producing their own formats, their own writing style, and we imagine things in digital that we would not have imagined a year and a half ago in this field. So there have been interesting things that have taken place, and we haven't reached the end of these possibilities yet. Laurent Bell, the Paris Philharmonic Orchestra, we experimented with digital before the crisis. We have a platform, and the epidemic interested me as an element. It says when you put a model under tension, what happens? What happened was that in a certain manner, and very quickly, we realized that there's a danger of standardization, because if we're looking for an economic model, there's only a star system that can put itself forward as the model. So in 2 or 3 years, we'll see the practically guaranteed exclusion of emerging art, young creation, or less visited repertoires and less seen or requested repertoires. The direct cost of your plateau has indirect costs with the, so you cannot cover all the costs. That's one problem. The second problem is it doesn't invalidate digital technology, but you have to think about it differently. There can be commercial sites like Netflix that propose an offer, but our position in culture is to think about the editorialization, what we can provide in addition that is close to creative educational thinking, and that we can put into relation with the universities, national institutes, European networks. We shouldn't no longer think at a national level anymore, but perhaps we should be thinking about all of the major halls in Europe to have a proposal that's not just a series of disjointed elements, but that really proposes a programmed vision. But I do agree, and that's the last point of the last 6 to 18 months, that the digital peaks are going down quickly now, so it's not a substitute for the real world. Françoise, would you like to add something?
And then I will give the floor to, on digital, yes, of course. Well, there was some kind of a leap which took place during the crisis with some mistrust in the cultural world, especially in the living shows and living theater, but you know, it does not replace the emotion of living art, you know, but digital is not there to replace, but it is there to provide access to those who are less or first access, but you shouldn't expect too much, and if you don't expect too much, it's worth doing it. So. Well, it's fine if we give it a shape, because, you know, if it is just a communication process, you know, we always do communication because we have to do tickets, you know, we inform, and but digital, if it has something to say, well, it has to be an artistic gesture. There must be must be work. You know, the filming of shows in France are of an exceptional quality because there are young directors who handle this and who give superb level of results. You know, I mean, if it leads to an artistic action, well, fine. It's much easier to receive, and it will be with us more easily. But at the same time, I feel that. You know, people at home stuck, locked down, for those who have access, because we have a population of of audience, you know, with little revenues. They don't even have a pad, you know. And for them, the black hole was, you know, they were lost to control, you know, lost to follow up, you know. The Marseille social fabric is quite alive, but some, you know, we're looking for them, you know, in the youth and the adolescent. Now, if digital is a way to break intimidation, to give a reference, a new museum curator who started lighting children paintings or through postcards. So, you know, this is important, and there is a possibility of an effect. If it's enough artistic enough, if there is an effect in digital, it has its room, and if it breaks the intimidation, and if we go for audience which normally would not come to theater, of course we use them, but I think there is something which is almost incompatible with performing arts. We have to defend one thing and its opposite. We have a very archaic art which, regardless of what happens, will take place. It will take place with all its arguments, you know, which have been here for ever. And that emotion cannot be replaced. Jean-Jacques Guilloni. I wanted to remind you that comparable studies shows that first digital does not lead to many jobs, you know. You mentioned that there are new audience, you know, coming from the digital, but at the commercial level, it is fairly difficult to quantify, to observe people already convinced by a brand or service, whatever. They can adopt the digital art when they don't know it well. It's more complicated than what was said, Laurent Bell. The digital will promote the bestsellers, you know, what is known. It works well, but the margins which correspond to in quantity, well, to correspond to what is produced, well, or in quantity, well, you know, they're very difficult to keep alive on digital, and we can sell products, but anyway, this is a question I'm asking. Can we generalize it to culture? It is possible, probable. Now, I'd like to ask you questions now concerning the way we project ourselves, hoping that we'll avoid a fourth wave in a couple of months. So anyway, are you confident as to the possibility to have the old and new cultural practices together, and the practice from lockdown versus old practices? For example, do you really think that people will want to go back to the cinema? We see that following the first 2 weeks after May 2019, well, frequentation, the audience fell. What's your feeling? I mean, are you, Masha Makiavis, are you optimistic? By nature, yes, we want to renew desire and open other doors. If we keep, if we say the subscribers will come, others will follow, we're very offensive. So in our actions and the way we get, remote audience, whatever. So this is something which is familiar to us. So we will push for it. But if we don't believe in it, who will believe in it? So this is the point. Who will? This notion of sharing, your hospitality, we have to convey it in any possible ways. And, in theater, there's a big door, of the cultural action, you cross the door, but there are many other ways to get an audience, especially we do we get kids on a boat in the museum, we explain to them what the museum is all about. They do a little cruise, off the coast, 40 minutes, with a story. So when they turn around, they say, oh, I live in a port, and maybe my family came by sea, possibly. And then they come to the Quai Rive-Neuve, where they've got the theater. So the first time they come to the theater via the sea, and there are many, how can I put it, byways, sideways, to recreate design in different structures. You know, if you sit in the ticket booth and you wait for people to call, well, it's not going to happen. So, or not much going to happen. We have this design, this practice, but this period confirms our conviction and our mission. If there is something that is well in position and which gives cohesion to the team, well, it is that our mission are burning. Jean-François Chenier, still in Marseille, you were saying early on that you were moved on May 19th morning to see that even before the opening of the museum, there was a queue, there was a line. Yeah, on the esplanade, or they were at 1:45. People were there. So, okay, who are they? You have to, you know, was it just you know, one-shot action? Is it? But we realized last year in 2020 we had a frequentation almost normal. We were 90% versus the previous year. But for the reasons I indicated, that is the fact that we have an audience. After the audience comes from the Provence-Alpes Côte d'Azur region, and we realized with the study we did on the audience that the audience was 7 years younger, so we'd gone from 42 to 35 years. What public policies have been trying to do for years now, you know, get younger audience. It's as part of our charter and our management and KPIs. But they were conjunctural region, you know, fear of the oldest to move last summer. I'm not sure it is reproducible this year. We'll see it, we'll see. But even if quantitatively speaking, audience will find the way to the cultural institution, it might not be the same public, but you know, we have to be careful as to the you know, on-spot analysis of this phenomenon. This is what you were saying about digital early on. That is, there have been movements. They're not in the same direction, but globally they go to towards something which is important. That is public audiences. You know, they never deal it with a singular word, and are clearly asking. You know, and it seems obvious, and we need to we have to be able to go and seek, you know, go and get public with social center. We have a bus which every Sunday for free brings in visitors from the north and east of Marseille for free to the museum, and it is great success because then. There is nothing more simple, you know, more trivial. So, if 10 years ago we'd been told that we would have done this, you know, having read the complete works of Pierre Bourdieu, we would have laughed. You know, it's not a topic, you know. But today we need to find actions which are not blocking actions. Jean-Jacques Guillonnet, the Samaritan opened its doors about a week, 10 days ago, 15 days ago. It's a building that is reborn. From the visitors of the Samaritan, did you have reactions about the restoration you did? Well, we should indicate that this shop, the flow. You know, it's not so much necessarily the business, but the flow. We got about 35 to 40,000 visitors per day for, you know, commercial building, and it shows there is an interest. As a financial director, I'd like it to be transformed into financial revenues, but you know, clearly there is an interest towards the achievement, what we've done, that is the restoration of heritage which has been damaged. You know, I mean. It's one of these extraordinary heritage which has been severely damaged by the underinvestment and so on and so forth. So we took this building, which is amazing, with the Art Deco, Art Nouveau cohabitation, quite unique in the history of architecture. Of course, we respected what the building was. Very few people remembered what it looked like because so. It it fuels a lot of interest. I don't know if we're in culture, but certainly we are in heritage and architecture indeed. So simply now to relaunch culture, there will be 2 billion euros dedicated to relaunching culture. Will it be sufficient? Or will we need to call on the private sector? Has the state enough margin of maneuvers, or do we need to call on billionaires, no names by the way, to save culture? Laurence Descartes. We love billionaires. We love billionaires. Well, what should be remembered is that, I mean, again, I'm back to the example of Orsay or the Louvre. I mean, those are, heavily subsidized sites. They're not here to make money. It's not business model is not profit. It's a non-profit organization. Yet we are in a financial mix for several years now, which integrates, of course, the increase of on resources and of the sponsoring. So I leave Orsay having initiated a project called l'Orsay Ouvert, which is a quite ambitious project for the museum, which is fully self-financed. There is no money from the states. They're Orsay's own revenues, and it calls upon U.S. sponsorship or patrons. If I take the case of the Louvre, the Louvre has major sponsors like LVMH, of course, AXA, MGN, they renew their trust to the Louvre. And this is important because then we can envisage something which is fundamental in this question of the redynamizing, the development and investment. That is, these sites should project and carry project. There is maintenance and renovation of buildings, in the case of the Louvre, everybody understands the scope of this permanent site that is the Louvre, but it is also the ability to better welcome the audience, offer better quality services. And this is most important. So we are, right now, Orsay and in the Louvre, we are adjusting our plans, pluriannual investment plan, 10, 15 years, and we never renounce the project and the projects and future. We don't want just to save or overcome, weather the wave. We have to project ourselves in the future. And it is for us to be inventive, to bring the public back, but also to keep having partnerships with support and faithful sponsors and patrons for future projects. We have to bet on culture and the return of the public. I have no doubt, actually, about that. So it will take time, fair enough. It may take different forms, but if I don't believe in the return of the public, well, I better stop now. I should change my business orientation. Laurent Bell, long live sponsors. Well, the economic question is an important part of this, but it's not the whole question of the relaunch. In this domain, we have to see that the state will face a problem for his own part. That is, he will need to fill in the gaps between now and summer 22. There will be holes, gaps. Not everybody will do the business, the turnover. And some institutions will have to be supported among the flagships and others. And normally, the state strategy about the relaunching plan is to look at the future and to look at future developments. So it will be caught in this vice, and will it be able to fill in the gaps and prepare the future? Well, this is the question that will be, this will be the challenge. But beyond that, or above this, there is a political problematics in the broad meaning of the word. That is, you understood that society in general is quite divided, fractured, fragmented, mutations of all sorts, economic and and environmental have increased this fracture. Well, culture is the reflect of this fracture. So here we do have not a triptych, but at least 4 key players in this. The state that we've just reminded, but caught between local authorities and the market above, which says that you're nothing. And there are local authorities themselves. It's not just the nationalistic fallback, but there are other forms of other priorities which don't always go in the good direction of culture in cities which are more recommendable than those run by the Rassemblement National. And there is what I said early on, the private sector, and I believe that we have to take it as a key player of this development. It's a mistake of part of the cultural sector to look at this in like as an antagonistic. And finally, there is the cultural sector itself, its ability to project itself, to have a vision about the future goals. This is a more essential problem, of course, than the net amount of the budget. Is it 2, 4, 5 that we will need? Because 5, if we need 5, I think, look at Mario Draghi. He doesn't say anything else. You know, we'll take 5. But what, to do what? To do what? And this is not as clear. This is work needs to be done. Other reactions, possibly? Well, concerning don't forget that in France, public funding of culture the state is about a third. 2/3 are done by local authorities. And in this discussion, we always talk about the state. And we need a deeper analysis of what may happen locally, except a few discourses which, in my opinion, did not go beyond the discourse, but local authorities, territorial authorities, were present in the restarting plan in a more discreet manner. But I'm not, we are not able today to know exactly what was put, but a lot of money has been put in. The city of Paris has a restarting plan for culture. It's more than 150 million. It's huge, it's quite a significant number. So the state played other roles which were important in the figures with the billions, One part is the cost of partial unemployment, which was shared by the cultural domain in large part and by some patrimonial institutions which had public right contracts, but injection has to do on how the rest of the economy, on unemployment, partial unemployment. So to restart a restarting plan when a future investment, if we stay in the restart, the cultural sector should not just be able to fill in the gaps, but to find investment. Virtuous investment. We're among economists, but it's more complicated because it's difficult for the cultural sector, which faces survival sometimes. At the same time to invent what could be tomorrow the cultural offering of post-crisis. And I think there is a collective challenge which is not easy. Just a word about the views from the sponsor, the patrons. Patrons just don't want to organize an evening to get his customers to have to improve his turnover. For that, he buys a loggia in Roland Garros. But it is essential. It's a business culture. It's an enterprise culture. We're looking for meaning. If the meaning is absent, it doesn't work. So it's not a call that I'm doing, but it must be understood on both sides for what it is. We can see what is the meaning of sponsoring our patrons for the companies. For often it is only perceived, and the idea is to feed culture. I have questions. One question which was sent, and then I'll give the floor to those of you who wish to ask questions. Don't you think that it is time to stop mystifying population by mixing culture and art? Okay, couple of seconds. I wouldn't say you have 2 hours, but okay. Culture is a work to art. It's the pathway. So these are devices we install so that art will take place and art will be shared, because our main topic is art. After all, this is what counts. So art and excellence and the sharing of excellence for the largest number. So this is what the topic is all about. So after, how do we do it? Of course, we talk about culture, because we need devices. Like in any show, you need a sort of a preparation, rehearsals, and then representations themselves. And culture will make it possible, the cultural fabric will make it possible for this premeditation of the work of art that will come to take place. And for this, today, we can see how the collective control is essential. We need to stop, I'm talking about theater, that theater are close to themselves, and the theater in the city will extend his arm, and we should be in line with cultural itinerary if we want art to prevail and to stay. The national drama centers, well, we are underfinanced, so it gives you a lot of imagination. It's like, they give you 2, how will you reimburse 4? So it's quite tiring, but it works, We have to look for the intelligence of the others, sharing of the others, the competence of the other. Of course, by multiplying disciplines and not do just theater, to open to the largest public, most diversified public, but it is also something to, we clearly, there must be cohesion, This is culture, with the work of art that belongs to the artist, and it is mysterious. But culture are conditions of art. Thank you very much. So we got a couple of minutes. Yes, 2 questions. Thank you for this discussion. A nice way to close this day. Now, I won't challenge your figures. Culture is 2.3% of the GDP, but 2.5% of jobs. What does it mean? It means that the culture as an activity is underestimated versus other activities. I won't compare to football, but I'm not sure that the museum guards or the stuff, And of course, an artist is not motivated by money, but still, if there is no money, how can you attract talents? And even if technologies will take money, is it a concern or not? Second question, and I'd like to have your opinion. In as much as I'm being told that 2.5 million want telework and leave cities. Well, do you want the public to come back? But now, shouldn't you go to the public, outside of the flagships, outside of major cities? If a person spends 2-3 weeks days per week in the country, he won't go to the Louvre on Sunday. He will stay in his garden. So, am I completely off track, or is this a concern that should, be discussed? It's too early, but let's wait. Or maybe those people will get back to work, But I think there is an issue that is worth studying, because if we do it in September 22, we might have missed something. Thank you for this great question. Who would like to answer? Well, those figures, 2, 3, 2, 5, are taken under the control of François. It is precisely because the cultural sector creates less added value than the. It is a labor economy, but it's not a profit economy. If you were to compare cultural sector to hairdressing, you will have the same observations. So it's figures are true there. Now, if I get the second point, that is, I think we should not underestimate. Well, we tend to have negative result of the action of public authorities for the last 50, 60 years. Well, there's been a scattering and a widening of the territorial offering and geographic offering, which is quite amazing. So sometimes we have to take this into account. So the number of contracts, the temporary contract has been multiplied by 5, the domain of museum is a good example too. So I think the geographical remoteness remains, but today, you know, it is a problem when it is congruent with social distanciation. I mean, the pure, you know, geographical remoteness is not less a marker of cultural inequalities. And honestly, it is an optical distortion because the major institutions, you know, we are first a district theater and we major train stations, you know, small trains, small, little trains. You know, theater has to move around. We're always running. We're always in the dissemination and exchange. So so it's an optical effect. Of course, the flagship is there, the house is there, but we go everywhere, and they come to us. So artists, but also the audience move a lot, and we go from the prison to the hospitals, and you know, it's the least we can do. We go where the public is. So it's an optical decision. You have to be careful because there's so anti-institution spirit right now. Sometimes we feel that we are between the police and the firefighters. You know, so it's a reflection. Thank you. Possibly not to fuel frustration. There was one question there. Yes, last one. Then we'll have to close. Hello. Thank you for this cultural contribution in the macroeconomy, inflation, and debt. I have a simple question. You mentioned competition between of Netflix and Amazon, but what about the competition of major international concert rooms, of theater? An example, before COVID, we used to say, well, I could see 2 concerts per month. During the COVID, the Mets, New York Mets and the New York Opera broadcast one opera per day. So I saw 1 opera per day for 1 month. Now, could there be citizens who, in fact, instead of going to the little theater in the countries, in province or to come to Paris, will simply get more cultured from the major centers than rather than to benefit from the cultural landscape, French cultural landscape? The Mets didn't wait for the COVID to spread. The contradiction of the Mets, because the model is quite a stereotype. There is no renewal of the repertoire of the program. You know, we know the program before COVID. The problem of the economic model, of the business model, where that has been analyzed, and nevertheless, the ecosystem functions because in major centers you mentioned, in competition with the Mets, there is the limited access through tariffs, which is more expensive to see Peleas in the Paris Opera than to sit in Strasbourg or elsewhere. So clearly, there is a complementarity, and regional operas have a card to play if all the players, local players, national and others, keep their share in the funding of these institutions. I don't think this human nature will concentrate on Netflix if you look at the Mets or to go and do Paris Opera. What do you? Well, it has 80 million deficit, so it would help. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for your participation.